Hey, welcome to A Little Better. My name is Daniel, and I'll be your host. This week, we're talking all about sacrifice. This episode's a little bit different than other episodes in the past. The first half, we're talking all about the problems with Genesis chapter 22 that we find with our modern Western eyes. We are asking a lot of questions about this passage. And then the latter half, we talked about the practical usage of sacrifice as a daily or regular rhythm of a habit in our lives as we walk to faithfully follow Jesus. Remember, our goal on this podcast is to know Jesus better and by the power of his Spirit to do better so together we can be a little better. Hey, welcome to the Little Better podcast. We're super excited to dive in from this past weekend's talk on week 4 of Habits for Change, and this is episode 4 on more on sacrifice. So we're talking all about sacrifice today, the habit of sacrifice. I shared this in my community group, but I was just excited that this was in the series because, we really don't think about sacrifice, or as you defined it, the act of giving back, which is a really cool principle to think of. It's already God's as a habit. We want it to be a normal, not just an abnormal practice that we do, the week of Christmas.
Yeah, it was good to have a non-controversial topic.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. And so, Drew, could you give us the sermon in 60 from this past weekend?
Sure. We looked at the story of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, God testing him, and we talked about how Abraham could do that because he knew what he had wasn't his, and he received it. He didn't earn it. And that he trusted God completely. And out of those things, it leads to our willingness to sacrifice back to God. And so we looked at how Abraham walked in faith and how we should follow his example, how we need the habit of sacrifice in our lives. And usually that starts by growing in your trust with God. So again, you're not going to sacrifice to something you don't trust in. And then out of your trust, you live in obedience. And that's not just really for sacrifice. That's really for everything in our lives. We got to trust God. And then out of that trust, we live in obedience to him. And so we said, we got to build a rhythm of sacrifice. We offered 90-day challenge, right? You give back to God for 90 days. And if you don't feel satisfied, we'll give you your money back. And so we kind of let it right there.
So you said that at the end, money. We were talking about money specifically. Why did we go straight to money when thinking about sacrifice?
Yeah, I think because in our culture, it's the thing we love the most. And again, that's a stereotype, a generalized statement, but I think it's very true. One of the hardest things to give back to God, the thing that we hold on to so tightly, is our finances, and that's kind of why we went that direction. Because again, I think God is not going to come to you and say, "Hey, give up your son or your daughter." He's not going to do that. But he does ask for a portion of our finances, 10% of our finances, and sometimes for certain people that feels like what he asked Abraham to do.
Money is a laboratory of the heart.
Yeah,
and you have the backing of the New Testament. I mean, some people have said, I haven't verified it, that Jesus talks more about money than hell.
It's true.
So, I mean, you're on solid ground to take it to money because that's where Jesus, pokes at the hornet's nest as well in our lives.
Yeah, where your treasure is, there's your heart. So
there's scripture all over. It was brought up in our community group that that was the one point that you didn't use a scripture reference for. And it's well, is it not there? That's what somebody was asking. I was like, yeah, Drew was just, he just wants more money. And I was like, no. It's all over. You can see Abraham as early, before the law, doing a 10% tithe to Melchizedek. You can see it over and over again throughout the Old and New Testament, the tithe being a 10% principle. And there's scholars that debate that, but the point is who has your heart inside of that. Well, this episode's going to be slightly different, so just some formatting and just a note for the listeners. This passage could be super problematic. So the first half, I'm going to watch our timer here so we don't go over our normal 30, 35-minute timestamp. But the first half, I want to ask some questions that could be in other people's minds about some problems that we would have in our post-Christian worldview of Judeo-Christian worldview versus the worldview of Abraham. All right,
I am so looking forward to Drew's answers.
So let's start off with this. So you brought up, Isaac. He probably just thanking God for his dad's faith. But if you're laying on the altar as Isaac, wouldn't you have more tensions with God rather than trust and faith with God?
Well, I think Isaac, based off the story, laid down willingly. So I don't think there was tension between Abraham and Isaac, because Isaac is probably old enough to push back on his dad physically. And he knows a burnt offering. This is not the first time they offered a burnt offering. This was a rhythm of sacrifice back to God in their lives. And so we know that based off the text too. He's like, Dad, we're missing the lamb. So he's been through this journey. He's carried wood. He's offered a burnt offering before. And so he knows there has to be a sacrifice there. And there isn't one.
He's like, where's the lamb?
When his dad is like, hey, I'm going to tie you up now, I think he got the picture. And so he could have easily fought, ran down the mountain. I mean, even if he's not stronger than Abraham, he could have just ran. Ran from his father. So you based off of what I would call common sense and understanding, Isaac willingly laid down. So there's a level.
Abraham like lassoed Western style, like get over here.
I mean, I don't think Abraham was a good old Texas boy. You know,
it was no sneak attack. Yeah, you just find the text in verse 9 of Genesis 22. In that last sentence, it says, "So he bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood." That just seems like a very this is what happened next, versus like he wrestled him down, tied him up, and threw him on the it doesn't seem forceful at all. And like I don't think based on the narratives in Genesis that they would be afraid to hide some of the details. If you read through Genesis and see some of the awful things that people do, you know, I don't think they would hide some of the details if it was a struggle or altercation. It seems like Isaac is very willing inside of how he responds.
Well, and remember, look at Abraham's life. You know, this wasn't the first time God called him to something crazy, right? Yeah. Leave your family and go to the land I'm going to show you. Okay, that's pretty radical. Yeah. You know, it's not as radical maybe as giving up your one and only son. And I'm sure in Isaac's life, again, we don't know how old he is, but we can probably assume at some point in his life, multiple times, he saw his dad obeying God, you know, doing what God says. And so I think this was instilled in him.
Yeah. And this is like one of the key, you know, the pinnacle moments that we have in Abraham's story where he listens to God and does what he says versus the times where he's like listens to God and he's like, oh, I don't trust you anymore. And, and then God's
it's a journey.
Calls you back to something else and like, okay, I'll trust you this time. It's like, oh, not this time. And so he just like up and down. It seems like a roller coaster of obedience.
Yeah. I think the big problem is that anyone would trust God this much, right? I mean, it's this problem with what Isaac's doing, we have just as big a problem with what Abraham's doing, that anyone, and they both, you know, they're both expressing this radical faith that is incredibly foreign to us.
And we would call this, you know, if this happened today, we wouldn't call this radical faith. We'd call this insanity. A radical.
Yes.
You know, this person is a radical.
Right.
And again, you know, I don't think God is going to, I don't want to speak for God, right? But based off my assumption in who God is and his character, and we're in a different time period, I don't think God's going to come to you and say, hey, Brad, would you give up your son or your daughter? So if he's saying that to you, talk to somebody.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Because if you think about human sacrifice in general in this context, Abraham didn't have a Christian worldview in this time frame. There was no such thing that existed. Like the Christian and the Jewish worldview has impacted our society deeply. Yeah. And even if you don't claim to be a follower of Christ, it has impacted the way you see the world in some way. At least you're aware of people who see the world in that way. And so for Abraham, he was surrounded by people who practiced human sacrifice, child sacrifice as a regular practice because they had to pay back the gods. They were worshiping the pantheon. They were doing all these crazy radical things because this is what the gods require. This is what the gods ask of them. And we find in Yahweh, or the one true God, the God of the Bible, the first God who actually provides the sacrifice for the sacrificer. He provides back to his people, where all the other gods are asking, like, feed us, or asking, in air quote, like that's what the belief was in the time of, they had to put food so that the gods would be able to eat, so that they could provide rain, so that they could provide food for them. Like, but in this, without, because God, what does God get out of this? It's just Abraham's faith and obedience.
Right.
It's not anything of tangible.
Yeah. That's what's so hard about this story
Yeah.
is you have to delete everything that you know because it didn't exist yet.
Yeah.
Right. This is at the very beginning of any society, any belief system. All that hasn't been established yet.
Yeah. None of that. None of the laws of Israel are in existence. Like none of those things
Hundreds of
are
years
there.
later.
Yeah, this is hundreds of years before any of that even happened. So Abraham's just operating off of like, hey, go somewhere that I'm going to show you.
An audible voice.
And he's going, okay. And and then he goes, and then he's like walking through this journey. And so it's really hard for us because we just project everything we know back onto this story and like, well, why do you do that? Why do you do this? And so it's there. Next question of tension. I think this is the biggest one that I had to wrestle through even when we were researching this is God says in verse 12 of Genesis 22, this is kind of when the angel of the Lord says, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. This is the phrase. Now I know you fear God. So did God not previously know? Does God not know everything in the world? Because we say that God has all the knowledge. He knows everything. He knows every possible outcome, every decision we will make, won't make, every thought in our head, every intention in our heart. But it seems from at least a surface level reading of this passage that God learned some information about Abraham.
Yeah, I think, and it pops up other places too, right, where God repents. Right, it seems like God changes his mind, and I, like I said, I'm really looking forward to Drew's answers. And one way I think we're just accommodating, God is accommodating our understanding, and our viewpoint and our perspective, on this. But yeah, obviously, theologically, we know that God does not change. We have solid scriptural backing for that. He doesn't need to develop, mature, know, and discover more. So everything that's happening here is for our benefit, not his, and changing us, not him. But Drew, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this statement is for Abraham, not for God. And so I put it like this. Okay, my daughter, she's homeschooled, right? And so there's times where we have to test her. And there's a lot of times when we test her that we already know she can do it, right? But we have to test her, and she takes the test, she crushes it, and I'm like, now I know you can do this. I already knew.
Yeah.
But again, remember, at the very beginning of this passage, it says God was testing Abraham. And so God knew how Abraham was whether he was going to pass or fail this test from the very beginning.
Right.
And so I think when the angel came to Abraham and said this, it was a confidence builder in Abraham. It's like, Abraham, I see this in you. Let me affirm this in you. It's not God saying, wow, phew, I was biting my nails there, and Abraham came through. Like, we just made it through this one. God knew. I think this statement is for Abraham and the confidence of God. I know you trust me.
Yeah. We were talking about something before we started filming as well, is if you view this passage as a whole, look at this full picture of a story, you were pointing out that if God was testing Abraham and he knew the outcome, whichever way this turns out, looking at the issue of human sacrifice or child sacrifice, that neither way is Isaac being put to death.
Yeah.
Because if Abraham disobeys God,
he's alive.
He's not going to kill him.
Right.
But God was testing him, and either way, Isaac's not going to die. So our tension with the human sacrifice doesn't even exist, really.
It really shouldn't.
Because God was never, no way this turns out does Isaac end up dead, unless he trips and falls down the mountain, right? And so like, either way, he's good. And one other thing that I want to point out about this knowledge is this is the Hebrew word yada, which is the Hebrew word yada. If you do a quick like Bible word study, if you look it up, just in Genesis 3:5 through Genesis 22:9, which is where this, or 22:12, where this passage, it's used like 25 times in 6 different ways. So I'll share these really quick. So it can be translated to know or learn information, to realize, to stumble upon, to make love. It's the same word for sex in the Hebrew Bible. To experience one very personally, if you want to think of it like that, or to be made aware of, or to confirm existing information. So it's everything from like I learned something new to a husband and wife had sex. Like it's that broad,
encompassing a lot
of encompassing relational word. And so however you want to say, like it did God experience Abraham's obedience that time? Like he actually experienced it versus other times when Abraham disobeyed, So if you translate it that way, it's not God learning. There's only one of the 6 ways that God is actually learning information. And so I don't think we could look at this passage and say, oh, see, it's God learning new content. He knew the content.
Well, and Abraham's journey of trust is up and down too.
Yeah.
So again, this is affirming to Abraham, who has blown it in certain
multiple times.
And how good does it feel in our lives when we are affirmed by people who, we do the right thing and they're like, hey, man, I know doesn't mean you're going to do it perfectly the next time. It just means I see what you just were willing to give up, and I'm affirming that confidence I have in you, that you trust me.
Yeah.
We do the same. We use the same language and mean the same thing.
Yeah.
We say I know, but really we already knew. But what we're doing is we're affirming to the other person we know.
Right. Yeah, because you think about Abraham's journey. He gives his wife away twice.
That's right.
He's like, oh, she's my sister. It's fine. And then he sleeps with a handmaid, an Egyptian, and then he sends her away. Like he's super passive in everything he does, right? He's so passive in his way of leadership. And this is a time where we talk about the pinnacle, like, look how great Abraham is. And it's like, okay, he had one pinnacle moment. Yeah. He was a flawed sinner, human being that is on this journey with
Genesis
God.
is pretty clear. Our works do not save us.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
And, when you mess up, you carry those with you, right? So I'm sure Abraham, right, he almost has bookends of successes, right? Go to the land I'm leading you. Yes, first one got it.
He did it.
This last one, sacrifice Isaac, got it. But in the middle, he's got a lot of failures in trusting God, and we carry our failures, right? I know a lot of people who struggle with like, man, am I good enough? Am I ever going to get this right? And the affirming power of God saying to Abraham, "I know you trust me." That is powerful in a person's life,
Right.
And through all the failures, he gets to look at him and be like, yes.
Yeah, in many ways, God was saying to Abraham, let me prove to you that you trust me.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about sacrifice inside of this and how it fleshes itself out in our lives. And the one thing that I thought of while we were listening to this message on Sunday, and you call to action of the application of this talk is maybe taking the 9-day challenge. What advice would you give a person whose spouse is maybe not on board? Because I mean, one person we didn't think about in this story because she's not a forefront character is Sarah, Isaac's mom, Abraham's wife. What are her feelings, towards this moment as they're marching back down the mountain, and she's clicking in her head, what happened up to? And then Isaac's like, "Hey, mom, guess what happened today?"
I'm thinking God graciously kept her totally in the dark.
It is a little different too, because in the society that Abraham lived in, women just didn't have much say or much right. I would, in my world, it's like, I got to talk to my wife about this.
Yeah.
I'm not sure Abraham was thinking that. It's just a different world.
Right.
And, but at some point, I wonder if that story ever
you
leaked
would
to
advise,
her. Yes.
People today to talk to their
100%.
wives.
Yes.
Have you guys seen the History Channels, The Bible, when they did, they teamed up with a few people? In this story, I think if I remember this correctly, it's when they're marching back down the mountain, it's Sarah's right behind a boulder, what just happened? She's looking at him coming down, frustrated and confused. I think that's how they present it. So
you did what?
What happened?
Every man has heard that one before, right? Though, you did what?
That's good.
But did you want us to answer that question?
So
what advice?
So what advice would you give? So think of it in the terms of, somebody hears the story, here's the talk, man, we haven't been tithing really anything, or, we've only been given 2%, and I want to bump it to 6 or 7, and their spouse is just utterly against it.
This is a tough one, right? This is really tough because I think there's different circumstances too. I think it depends on, where does your spouse stand with the Lord?
Yeah.
I think that's the primary.
Yeah.
Right? What's more important is that your spouse would cross the line of faith than give back to a church, right? I think that's a huge step because it's hard for people who are far from God to understand that we would give a portion of our income back to God.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to convince somebody without that relationship. So I think that takes the primary. If your spouse is lost and you're trying to say, hey, we should give more. And to me, I would go after, I would pray that your spouse would come to know the Lord before she even agrees to giving more money. I think that is the priority. Now, if your spouse knows the Lord and is still pushing back, I think you just have to continue to love your spouse like Christ loved the church, right? That's for us men. And I think it's a conversation, and it's you don't have to rush to it, right? You don't have to, everything is a journey, and we have to learn to trust God. And so I would continue to have conversations, continue to read books together, talk to other couples who maybe have struggled with this. I think this is a great thing about community groups, right? You can sit in your community group and ask questions. It's a safe place. Meet with a pastor and talk about, hey, when we give, where does it go? And what, some people just have trust issues with churches. Like, hey, we give, and I don't see the budget lines of where my money goes and stuff like that. And so have this conversation, get your questions answered. I think that helps in the journey. And pray.
Yeah. I certainly don't go into it assuming you're absolutely right and trying to convince this moron to get on board. So we walked through this years ago when Northridge had their first capital campaign to build the current auditorium. And that was the first time we even had the idea of a capital campaign. I mean, which was a culture shock and different for us. It was like, really? People are just going to give faithfully. What are you doing here? All kinds of pushback, suspicion, whatever. But it was walked through very slowly, and a godly vision was cast. And then Karen and I were getting down to the point of how much would we commit, to this capital campaign. And I had a number that was very different than her number. And that was tense. I mean, that was a tough time. But I did know that if I got my way by bullying, that would be wrong.
Yeah.
You're stepping over her. I mean, God gave me this wife who is, I would say, more godly than me. And if she's got questions, let's talk about it. It's possible that I'm just being ridiculous, or it's possible that I'm being faithful. Ultimately, she agreed to that number. And it would be very interesting for me to ask her now, 10 years later. I'm pretty confident she would say, she was, it was tough, but that she was not bullied, that she was on board. And that was huge. It was a huge number. That was just, we still had kids, young kids, and thinking about how we're going to educate them and everything else. And it seemed to jeopardize all of that. But we, committed to a big number, but we were both on board. It took a long time to get there. It wasn't easy, but I would definitely say, hey guys, don't bully your wives, and God gave them to you for a reason. And, it's, I've been very grateful, for her counsel, in many things, but if we're to be one flesh, I think you do need to step through that in unity.
I think one of the most powerful prayers in a marriage, especially when there's disagreement, and let's say for some reason you feel like you are you're in the right space, right? You feel like this is the direction you need to go. I think one of the most powerful prayers is, God, please bring my husband or my wife with me, right? I think what we do a lot of times is we try to be the aggressor and produce the change that God needs to produce. And I think, I'm so guilty of that. Like, I'm going to manipulate my wife into thinking the way I think. And I think if you are in this situation, one of the most powerful things you can do is not try to convince your spouse to agree with you. If you do really feel like what you're trying to do is the godly path, the right path for your family or whatever, just pray this simple prayer. God, would you bring my spouse to where I am, right? Would you move her heart? And I'm going to patiently wait for you to affirm that I think that's an affirming thing too, to know, hey, this is the path God wants you, is like, hey, God, I need you to help my spouse come come along with me, and I'll wait until that happens. I think there's something beautiful in that. It takes your hands off control too. You can easily say, I didn't manipulate or overplay or overstep this position. I allowed God to do what he saw best.
Nice. Well, let's ask another question about application more. What are other things than money that we could think about sacrificing to God? What are other things that come to you guys' mind, or things that could be complicated to sacrifice when God could be asking us to take other steps? You could think about the habits, think about putting other spiritual habits in your life. Or just other things in general. What comes to your guys' mind?
I'll go big picture, Brad. You can get practical. I think anything that you love more than God needs sacrificed.
No.
So again, this is not just what are the things in my life I need to give up? It's anything that takes God's rightful place becomes an idol, and that needs sacrifice. That can be your spouse, that can be your kids, that can be your job. So anything you love more than you love God needs sacrifice. And I don't mean, okay, let me bring some clarity to that, okay?
I was going to ask for some clarity.
So,
what would it look like to sacrifice your spouse? Use that one. I know that one sounds a little extreme. Even those words coming out of my mouth. It's like, what would that look like though in your life?
Yeah, when your spouse is getting in the way of your relationship with God, and that is not your problem, not their problem. Just for the record, right? That's not their fault. It's your fault. It means, hey, I'm gonna create some space. Not like I'm leaving space, but I need to reprioritize things in my life. So I need to put God first. So I need to be spending time with God. Again, the word sacrifice feels like such a horrible word there, right? But what we're saying is anything in your life can become an idol. And when it becomes an idol, you have to reorder your life in priority. And God always needs to be at the top of that priority.
Right. Remember the word sacrifice from Sunday. We talked about it at the beginning of the talk. Or in the beginning of this episode, is to give back.
Yeah.
It's like at the core, it means to give it back. So the rightful owner, being God, he owns everything. We're giving it back to him. It's not we're slitting its throat and putting it on. It's like that's what when I think of sacrifice, the first thing I think of is like animal sacrifice in the Old Testament law, like of killing something.
Yeah, and a great example of this for me, like my wife is my best friend, and what I often do is I worry about her, right? And what that worry is she becomes so important to me that I don't trust God with her.
Yeah.
Same with my kids, right? Like they go away and I'm like, oh no, what's going to happen? Are they? It's like, no, I'm going to give that back to God and say, God, you love them more than I. They're yours, and I trust you with them. That's what I mean by a sacrifice. That's a great example. I think a lot of people worry about their spouse and their kids, and the reason why they worry is because they're not in control. And to give it back to God is saying, God, they're yours.
Yeah. But they think they can control them, protect them more than God can, better than God can, provide for them better or more.
That their best is better than God's best.
Yeah. And when you said we need to sacrifice anything we love more than God, we need to heap huge skepticism on our own our own opinions. I don't love anything more than God. Oh, really? And a lot of the times that gets pointed out to us. I'll give you an example for me, which was, and I will talk about more than money. We're going back to money. Yeah. But, years ago, my dad died at the age of 52. There was a bit of an inheritance, that, Karen and I had. It enabled me to go to seminary. But, that money was, sitting, in investments. And I think year 2000, there was an internet bubble burst, and that... Because I had always told myself, I don't care about money. My heart is not wrapped up in money. My security is not in money. When that dropped like 30%, it was just like I was so anxious. I was so, and I remember saying to myself, I had no idea I loved money that much. I had no idea I put that much trust in money. So that's where you have to follow through on some of these acts, right? You say, oh, I don't have a problem with that. Really? Well, then give it up.
Yeah.
And, find ways, to do it. And as far as big picture goes, I know a lot of time people say time, talent, treasures, right? We've been talking about treasure, but it may be talents, right? Which you are routing in God's direction.
How would one do that?
Like a career, right?
Yeah.
There are career choices, right? Where it's like, okay, here's ways that I can optimize it in a way that benefits me, right? Maybe this will, provide for my family and make me rich or famous. A lot of us aspire in that direction. We don't quite get there, but
Most of us.
But instead say, I'm going to give this, to the kingdom somehow, or I'm going to choose, I'm going to, work less so that I can serve more, or change my career direction, all because of kingdom values. There are sacrifices that could be made there. And certainly with time, it's just, would you give up vacation time? Would you give up, personal time, to do other things?
Yeah, I did devotions with my kids this morning, and it was Colossians 3:23, and it makes me think of that verse. Whatever you do, do it as you're doing it to the Lord, right? And so with your gifts, and we're going to talk more about these things, so I'm not going to go into detail, because we're going to talk about your time and your talents, serving in the local church. I'm always amazed at our worship teams, right? I'm like, wow, look at the talent. The volunteers, right? Other than we have, 2 paid staff people, volunteers giving up their time, and man, can they sing and can they play instruments? I always aspire, because I've always wanted to be able to sing or play a guitar or drums, and I just can't. Okay, I can't. So
I think Bandel can give you lessons if you need to.
But I also we have people who just have an amazing gift to teach kids, right? Of just making the Bible come alive for little ones who use that, sacrifice time on Sunday, a day off, where they use those gifts. There's so many people in our church in overlooked areas and in on the stage areas that use their gifts and their time and their talent for the glory of the Lord.
Right.
Yeah. And those can all be, sacrifices giving them back to God. You think of like things tied up into that as comfort. As another thing that could be, or a way of life, a lifestyle. Inside of that, there could be so many things that God is asking us to do. I have 2 questions to wrap up. This episode may be a little longer. The first one is what are steps? Another question that came to my mind about this passage, but it really applies to our life. How do I know when it's God asking me to do something that may seem a little crazy? And I'm not, a pastor I used to serve with used to use this analogy, like, don't like put God to the test and like climb out on the limb, like, and like turn around with a chainsaw and saw it off. Like, God, don't let me fall. Like, and like inside of this, but be sure that it's God. How do we know though? How do we know that it's like God asking us, whether it's giving a large sum of money or if it's like sacrificing a time, taking a career change of, it could be a whole plethora of ideas that somebody could be having.
Well, we certainly have impulsive ideas. So the idea that it would last, right? Don't do things instantly, if there is time to pray, to reflect and see, does this last? But also, I'm always going to be looking to loop in the most godly people I know, whether in my community groups or other people to reach out to and say, what does it sound like to you? Does this just make sense to you?
I have a tension here, just because I feel like there are good filters, like you said. There's one, does this align with God's word, right? Obviously, and talk to godly people. I also think people use these as crutches to talk themselves out of big things God is asking them to, and so it's a very hard line of, right? Because I think big steps of faith are hard, and we gotta go for it sometimes, right? And again, I'm not saying you gotta make sure that it's God, right? And there's a lot of ways you can do that, but at some point you gotta take a leap of faith, right? And so I think God calls us to big things sometimes, and we use the filters we're supposed to see if it's God in manipulation to somehow talk our way out of not wanting to do the thing God wants us to do.
Absolutely.
And so we have to be careful with that.
Yeah, like you said, like a spouse would be an easy out. Oh, she's not on board. Well, wait a minute, maybe God's calling you to teach and guide and disciple her.
There's always roadblocks in the way of big faith steps. There is. And, I think Isaac would have been one of those, right? Abraham's like, okay, God, I'm going to do this. What about Isaac? Right? How and God takes care of those things. I wonder if like Abraham was just like, did he tell his son? Did he, at some point he had to, but did he wait till he got to the mountains? Like, you're the sacrifice, Isaac. And God just God moved in Isaac's heart. How did that work out? And I think anytime it comes to sacrificing or following God, do we know it's God? Yeah. We need to make sure it's God, 100%. Like, don't just. Sometimes we get these crazy ideas, and it's all us, right? Because it's our pride saying, if I did this, people would notice. That's not God. That's your pride. So you got to be careful. Run through the checklist, but don't use the checklist to come up with some excuse not to do something. Sometimes a little bit wild and crazy for the Lord.
Yeah, and then I would even add to that, just add to the conversation, like, do you have the habits, or are the other habits like as a normal practice in your life? Like, I think sacrifice, especially when talking in Christian circles, is a glorified one. Like, oh my gosh, like look how much they gave up for God. Like, it's like the glorified one. But when we talk about like, do you daily pray, read your Bible, and maybe serve at church on a weekly basis, like, and it's behind the scenes and it's messy and it costs you, like, that normal grind is that those aren't like, oh man, he reads his Bible every day. And it's like, it's not.
Well, those are the important ones.
Those are important, like, right? And so it's like, do you have some of those in place to have those spaces carved out for God to be molding your heart over time, so that when that big step is, it's like, I know God's.
Sometimes you don't even have to run through the filters, because the filters are always running.
Yeah,
right? When you're reading God's word, when you're spending time praying, and you hear God's voice, you're not like, oh, was that God or is that me? No, you consistently live that way. You're close to God, and so wow, it's the same in every relationship. When my wife says something, I'm not like, hey, is that my wife?
Are you sure? I'm like, actually, we're gonna have to pray about this. I need to go consult wise counsel whether I should listen to you.
But I think what you said is so important, because I think about when I ran a marathon, it would be, I could say, here's my sacrifice. I'm going to show up at the marathon and run 26 miles, 385 yards. No, that you're an idiot, right? You needed to have had, 18 to 24 weeks of daily sacrifices. The sacrifice isn't on the race day. The sacrifice is the weeks, months of little sacrifices. I sacrifice by setting my alarm for 5:30 a.m. every morning and getting out and doing a run, and those were the sacrifices that mattered. So Abraham, I'm sure, had a history of little sacrifices that prepared him for the mountain moment, right? I mean, that didn't come out of the blue. God prepared him for that. There's a sacrifice we have to make daily. Yeah. I love what you said about
that. Last question, then we'll wrap up this week's episode. Immediate obedience to God. Why is that important, and how do we practice that?
Well, because God has the final say. It's just a matter of trust, right? I'm trying to teach my kids this, right? It's funny. The things we do with our kids, we often fail to do with God. Immediate obedience, right? God, that's why we call him God, right? He is master. He is Lord. And we don't question, well, we might question our boss, but at the end of the day, your boss has the final say. And if you don't obey, guess what happens? It should be the same with God. When God calls us to something, when he says something to us, it's, okay, I'll do it right away. And that immediate obedience is a gauge for me, for my life, and for many people's lives, of how much I truly trust God.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is with God, and you think about Abraham's story, is his God's track record of faithfulness. And even if a situation is sticky and doesn't turn out the way we desired it to, he always is working, for his glory and for our good. And so, like, to trust God, even when you don't see the outcome, even when you don't see what's on the other side of the fence, and he says, jump over the fence, like, or whatever that is. It's a silly example, but he has a track record of faithfulness. And even when it doesn't look good, he is still faithful, and he's still working if we truly believe, that passage in Romans 8:28 that's on coffee mugs, right? That he works all things together for his glory and for our good, then we should trust him and do what he says when he says it. Like, the thing is, you preached on Gideon in that trust series a couple of months ago, and the passage where Gideon in Judges, he's like, fleece, okay, all right, if there's dew on the fleece, then I'll know it's you, God. And then the next day he's like, all right, well, if there's dew around the fleece but not on the fleece, then I was like, I never want to be Gideon in those moments of like, all right, God, listen. If you put dew on the middle of the fleece, but not on the, it's like, it's just like, all right, just do what God says. Like, even if it's going to be hard, even if you're not going to like it, even if people are going to laugh at you, like, just do what God says.
And sometimes immediate is really important. I think of my kids, right? When I say stop, I need it to be immediate sometimes because we're walking across the street, cars coming, stop. If that immediate obedience doesn't happen, sometimes God is saying, hey, do this immediately because he's protecting you from something that's coming, right? And sometimes he says, go, and he wants to move you to keep you from something coming your way. Like the immediate, we don't see the big picture. We don't. Yeah. We have a minute focus of what God is doing. And we trust him because he sees way more than we do. He sees the dangers that are coming and he wants to keep us from. He sees the blessings that are on the other side if we would just break through and push through. And immediate, I think, is important because timing in so many areas of our life is very important.
Yeah, I mean, that's a habit too, right? Delay is a habit, a bad habit, and that's not what you want to, the muscle you want to strengthen is that immediate response. Yeah. And I would also say, it's just in terms, we do come up short, right?
Yeah,
in
we
so
do.
many ways. Neighbors messing up and everything else. It just, reminds us this isn't about getting a good report card.
No,
right?
Yeah, it's like you see God's grace all throughout Abraham's story. Like God could have shifted and be like, all right, I'm trying somebody else. Like you disobey me one too many times, but that's not how God works. God works, and his thumbprint of grace is just all over the Bible,
right.
Old and New Testament.
And all of this just paints the picture, as you said, for Christ. It just, it's just like, so much of it is just an education of how impossible it is for us, right? I mean, we it's just hammering that silly myth out of our heads.
Yeah. And the gospel here in this story is so beautiful, right? You see Abraham and Isaac climbing a mountain. What did Jesus do? He climbed a mountain for us. And, we don't often like to look at it this way, but it was God who held the dagger and killed his son.
Right.
Jesus didn't, the Romans didn't kill him. The crucifixion didn't kill him. Jesus surrendered his life to his Father. That is the picture of the gospel that probably other stories don't give you that full, graphic, violent picture of God taking his son's life.
But it's the complete inversion of human sacrifice. It's God's sacrifice.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow, that's good. No better way to end. Well, thanks so much for listening this week on A Little Better. Thanks so much for liking, commenting, and subscribing. Share this episode with your friends if you found it helpful. We'll see you next week.